glory forever. On May 25th, 2020, just as the world, you may remember, just as the world was shutting down with COVID restrictions, George Floyd was killed by police officer Derek Chauvin. And as you also probably remember, the backlash was significant. Protests and riots erupted all over the place, perhaps most violently in Portland, Oregon. It was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was also the beginning of a movement to remove statues of famous white men such as General Robert E. Lee and also Thomas Jefferson from public places. The basic reason that people gave for wanting to tear down these statues is that they didn't want to celebrate anybody who had owned slaves or had somehow involved themselves in racial oppression. And so in order to secure a more just future, they said we have to leave our checkered past behind. And that means, among other things, we need new heroes. For instance, in Roanoke, Virginia, in place of Robert E. Lee, the famous Civil War general, we now have, you can check this out, we now have a statue of Henrietta Lacks, who was a black woman whose cells were taken without her consent after she had died of cancer. And the message behind the change of statues is really clear. We're no longer going to celebrate oppressors, now we're going to celebrate the oppressed. That's the culture in which we live. And what that means is that there is a change in the air. Can you not feel it? Even if you don't pay attention to things like this, even if you don't like to talk about things like this or think about them, it's really hard to avoid. There is a kind of revolution going on, and its name really is post-liberalism. That word may be a little unfamiliar, so I'd like to explain it. The word liberal just means freedom. And anytime you add an ism to a word, it kind of turns into this grand and sweeping idea. The term liberalism, then, is this grand and sweeping idea about how to organize society. It means that the best way to organize society is to give the most amount of people the most amount of freedom. And this is the basic idea behind the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And thus, historically, most Americans, whether we consider ourselves conservative or progressive, have always been what we would call liberal. That is, we believe in freedom. And what is more, we don't just believe in it, we believe we've got it. Whatever its problems, Americans historically have always been proud of the fact that this is one of the places where people can be free, right? We have a song. This is the land of the free and the home of the brave. So that's American liberalism. Freedom is good and we've got it. That's the idea. Freedom is good and we've got it. Post-liberalism says the opposite. Yes, freedom is good, it says, but no, we do not have it here. We have never had it here. Look how we treated the Native Americans. Look how we treated black people in the slave trade. Look at how we treat the poor today. The American project is a failure, it says. It didn't create freedom. All it did was sort of take oppression over here and put it over here. It redistributed it. So, therefore, says this way of thinking, America should not be proud. We should be ashamed. And that's why we need to tear down the Robert E. Lee statue and put up Henrietta Lacks. Freedom may be a good thing, but for most regular people, we've never really known a day of it. That's the message of post-liberalism. Well, I start my sermon like this. This may be concerning to you to start a sermon like this. I don't start it today to get you upset or to start a political war. I'm not even interested in showing you my political cards. I'm not actually making a political point. The point is not political. The point I'm making now is emotional. What I'm saying is that today we live in a culture that is very sensitive about power. We get really worked up, one way or the other, whatever direction you lean. We get really worked about words like oppression, slavery, power, and poverty. Are these not hot-button words today? As a culture, we tend to be really tolerant about sexual sin. We hear about things like shoplifting or fraud, and we're like, yeah, well, it's the world. But if there's one thing we really can't stand today, it's injustice. Culture. Well, this morning we're in Exodus 21, where we're going to read about God's laws about slavery. Not God's laws abolishing slavery, but rather God's laws regulating slavery. And I know that in this culture, that makes people upset, afraid, and mad. Because, well, God's not supposed to have laws about slavery. He's supposed to have laws only against slavery. If God sanctions slavery of any kind, then the only thing that can mean is that he's unfit to rule, right? He can't be just, he can't be good. That's how modern people think. I remember actually reading Exodus 21, about 20 years ago. I probably should have read it before I was in my 20s, but I hadn't. And I remember reading it, and, these laws that we're about to read made me afraid, embarrassed. I hoped that none of my non-Christian friends would discover them because, well, how am I going to explain all this? I kind of felt like sweeping them under the rug. Well, that was 20 years ago, where the cultural temperature was a lot cooler about these things. Well, that's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to try to explain all this. That is, today we're going to look at God's laws on slavery, and we're going to ask this question: is God's law just? It's an important question for our worship, because if God's law is not just and God gave them, God is not just. And if God is not just, he is not good. And if God is not good, how can we come here and say he is? It's an important question for our worship. It's also an important question for our evangelism. Many people have turned away from God because they feel he is unjust. Either people who have known him and have had questions and concerns and they've walked away, or people who have never known him, they have never read the scriptures, they've never really encountered him, but they still suspect that they could do a lot better off without such a God as this. I mean, have you noticed the way that people change, the way that they talk? It used to be that people were turned away from God, or they were sort of turned off by God because they felt like he was too good for them. They said things like, if I went to church, the place would fall down around my ears. Now, maybe there's a few people who still speak like that. More and more, especially in the younger generation, what they're saying is things like this. Not, if I went in, it would fall down on my ears in a kind of judgment, but rather, why should I worship a God who is so cruel and oppressive? That's the question today. So we used to feel like he was too good for us. Now, increasingly, we feel like maybe we're a little too good for him. So today I hope to give you two things. First, I hope to give you some answers for yourself. Maybe these ideas have troubled you. I'd like to give you an answer. Second, I would like you to give an answer, or to be able to give an answer to others. Right? We all know people who believe that these laws and laws like them make our God unfit for worship. And so I hope to show you today how to talk with them and how to understand, for them to understand the truth. Here's the basic truth that we're going to look at. The kind of slavery talked about here in Exodus 21 is a very different kind than we are usually thinking about. It's very different from American slavery. It's very different from European slavery, where innocent people, where they were kidnapped and they were treated like animals without hope of freedom ever. And such forms of slavery, the Bible condemns absolutely. If you kidnap in the Old Testament law, you get killed for it. Historically, it was Christians, such as William Wilberforce, who condemned such practices because of the Bible. As it turns out, not all slavery is the same. And so there are different forms, and not all forms are evil. And so I want to ask you to sort of like, if you feel exercised or excited about this sort of particular topic in either direction, ask you just sort of to not get too much on your toes about it yet until give me a little time to unpack this. That is, don't get too caught up in the word. Sometimes different things are meant by the same word. Remember Crocodile Dundee? That's not a knife. This is a knife, right? Same word, different knife. Come with me to Exodus 21. You're already there? I guess I didn't hear any pages turning out. Exodus 21, starting at verse 1. I'm just going to read the first 6 verses. We're going to look at 1 through 11 today, but I'll start with the first 6. Now these are the ordinances which you are to set out before them if you buy a Hebrew slave. He shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons and daughters, the wife and the children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out with them alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. If a man sells his daughter, I'll keep going to 11. And if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she's not to go free as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. All right, so we're in Exodus 21, 1 through 11. We're going to ask, is God's law just? And the big idea is this, that yes, they are. They stand up to scrutiny. God's laws on slavery stand up to scrutiny. And why? Because once we get into the details of them, on the face of it, it can seem really unfair and unjust and a real problem. When we get into the details of it, what we see is that these things are designed to bring blessing. Namely, 2 things, and these are the points of the sermon: restoration for the poor and rights for the weak. So, in verses 1 through 6, what we see is the slavery laws around men, and then 7 through 11, we're going to look at the slavery laws around women. Let's think about the slavery laws around men. Just notice with me how very different this is from the kind of slavery that we're used to thinking about. First of all, this is not racist. It's not the slavery that justifies itself by pretending that other people are not made in the image of God. And that is really what we had to do with American slavery. We had to pretend that black people were somehow not fully human. We said that they either lost it or never had it, that they were marked with the mark of Cain, that they were marked with the mark of Ham. And so we were justified somehow in enslaving them because of our innate superiority of the race, right? That's what we're familiar with, and that's what would happen here in our history. And it was racist and it was evil. And that is not what Moses is talking about here in Exodus 21. Look at verse 2. We see it in this little phrase in verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew slave. Who's buying Hebrew slaves? Hebrews are buying Hebrew slaves. So this is not a slavery of people from different ethnicities. This is a slavery of people from the same ethnicity, which means that racism cannot apply. Not racist. If it's not racist, it's also not forever. Look again at verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. Again, this is very different from American slavery. In American slavery, there was no exit plan, right? No time stamp. Here there is. Hebrew slavery lasts 6 years. On the 7th year, he goes out free. Very interesting. If you look at a parallel passage in Deuteronomy 15, we're told actually on that day where that slave goes out, he doesn't just go out empty-handed. In Deuteronomy 15, we're told just what's supposed to happen on that day. This is Deuteronomy 15, verse 13. He says, when you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat, and you shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Isn't that interesting? I mean, how's that for different, right? I mean, not only did this slave go free, but the day he goes free, they throw a party at the master's expense. Because on this day, what's supposed to happen is the master is supposed to see himself. This party is a little exodus, right? As a Hebrew, the master was once a slave, and now both are free. All right, so far these laws are, I think, fairly straightforward, easy to explain. Verse 3 and 4 get a little tougher, so let's go a little deeper. Exodus 21, verse 3. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. Now, on the face of this, it looks like a clear example of slavery undermining marriage and family. If the master gives the slave a wife, then she and the kids stay with the master, and the slave goes out free. I got to say, there's more going on here than meets the eye. To explain it, I need to back up and give a couple reasons and try to understand what's going on in slavery in this culture. So there's two reasons why someone might go into slavery in this culture. The first one is theft, and the second one is money mismanagement. So let's look at theft. Thieves in ancient Israel do not go to jail. They pay restitution. In the law, thieves pay back double. Why? Well, paying back what you stole just sort of pays back what you stole. That's not exactly a punishment. But if you pay back double, suddenly what happens is that you get put in your neighbor's place, right? You now know what it feels like to have that same amount that you stole. Now you're like, oh, that's expensive. Maybe I shouldn't do that to my neighbor. What that means is that it puts you in your neighbor's shoes. If the thief could not pay back double, then what ended up happening is that he could sell himself into slavery. The idea was that he would work to pay off the debt. Instead of a jail system, now we have a kind of slavery system that works to pay off the debt of thieves. Now, think for a minute. Again, the word slavery is a hot-button issue, but think about the humanity of this as opposed to even what we have done today. Instead of going to jail or paying a fine to the state, in ancient Israel, the thief goes and lives with who? A family. And they work for them for 6 years. It might be the family that he stole from. It might be another family. What's going on during those 6 years? Well, he's learning to work instead of steal. At the same time, what's going on, instead of being separated from people, he's connecting with people, bonding with them. The result, it says here in verse 5, it's interesting that this could even be possible. The situation in verse 5 is not really possible, honestly, in the system of slavery that we have seen in our history, but it is possible here in the Hebrew system, which is the thief moves from being antisocial to being social, because at the verse 5, what we see is that he says, not only is he not going to steal anymore, but, he loves his master and wants to stay with him permanently. Verse 5, the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I will not go out as a free man. This master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear. The idea there is that he's keeping his ears open to the master. So there's a way, even as Christians, where the Lord takes us as slaves and pierces our ears, because our ears now are open to the master. When we pray, what are we saying? Speak, Lord, for your servant heareth. Right? Our ears are open. Well, his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Now, again, it's not clear whether the master here is the same man that he stole from, but it might be. Now, think about that. You steal something from somebody, and then the system of justice is that you go now and work not just for them, but with them over a period of 6 years. And by the end of that, you're saying, "Oh man, this guy's like a dad. This guy's like someone who I love now." He's now loves him so much that he doesn't want to leave. Now, I mean, when I think about that, I think now that would be a good plot for a good Hallmark movie, right? I would call it like From Slave to Son. I don't even like Hallmark movies, but it's touching to think about someone moving from that place to this place, and this system is again, it's there's a humanity in it. Okay, the other system for the other reason for slavery is not just theft, but money mismanagement. Now, that's a topic a lot of us can kind of connect with, right? Some people are just not very good with money. They work, they really do, they work hard, and yet it seems like at the end of the month they can't pay their bills. And so what could they do when the bills come in? Well, what have we done in our system? Well, you can go bankrupt, I suppose. Before then, we had debtors' prisons. Again, we had prisons for these sort of things. Well, in this case, what they could do instead was sell themselves into slavery, and for 6 years they could work to pay off their debts. Now, what are they doing while they're doing this? They're learning how to work better, and they're learning how to manage their money. And by the way, yes, slaves in this system could earn money. The idea is that at the end of 6 years, this guy is going to go out better than he came, and it's a kind of training program. So these days, we hear a lot about restorative justice rather than punitive justice. Restorative justice is supposed to be very new, very progressive, and as it turns out, it's very old. Restorative justice has been around for a long time, and we see it right here in these slavery laws. Okay, so now we're ready to begin looking at verse 3 and 4, because if a man is married, he goes into slavery and he stays married. After 6 years, he still is married. The master has no authority to take away from him that which is his. That is, even as a slave, his family is still his family. So far, so good, right? But then the question emerges, and this is the one that troubled me the most. Why, if the master gives him a wife, why in verse 4 does it say that the kids and the wife stay behind? That's the one that sticks in our throats. Well, it seems strange, but as I studied this week and have been looking at it for a while, the answer, I believe, is this. It's to protect the wife and the kids. Notice what it does not say. Notice that it does not say that they're not married anymore. Notice that it doesn't say that he can't come and visit. It does not say he has to give them back. What it says is that he cannot take them away with him yet. At any point, this is also part of the slave system, is that a slave may be redeemed. There's a price. The money that has been the reason that they're into slavery is because it's a money thing. It's either for slavery or it's for money mismanagement. That price can be paid. At any point, he might be able to pay that. What that means is that if he's being a responsible worker, like hopefully he's being trained to do here, he's going to be able to take care of them. So he goes away, they're still here, and if he's learned all of his lessons about not being a thief or about learning how to deal with money, then he's going to be able to redeem them, and they're going to be well taken care of. Rather than a cycle that continues poverty upon poverty upon poverty upon poverty, which is, I didn't know how to deal with money, now I've got wife and kids, and I still don't know how to deal with money, and it continuates the cycle. So if he goes and he can buy them back, and they're doing well, that means the training program worked. All right, so what this does, then, this system is interesting to me because it actually protects the master as well as the slave and the slave's family. It helps the master by protecting his investment. He's paid for work for 6 years. He's expecting that. And if this lady goes away after 6 months, well, it's kind of hard. But it's also protecting the slave and the family by making sure that he's not going to fall right back into slavery again. So the point of these laws is blessing. They do not oppress. They bring restoration to the poor. I find that very beautiful. Restoration, the idea. All right, now let's look at verse 7 through 11. These slavery laws they're really different from what we're used to. And again, just on the face of it, we might think, oh, slavery laws, I'm not dealing with this, I hate this. But again, if we kind of don't get ready to pounce on it, what we see is that this is really a very different thing. They're really designed to bring restoration to the poor, and now we're going to look at, they're also designed to bring rights to the weak. Look at verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a slave, or a female slave, she's not to go free as the male slaves do. She's displeasing in the eyes of her master who designated for herself. Then he shall let her be redeemed, if he does not have the authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food or clothing or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Oh, just notice all the authority that the master does not have here. Notice the things that are being limited here. It may be concerning to us about what this master may do. We'll get to that. But first, just look at all the things he can't do. First, he may not cut her free and leave her destitute. He may not sell her to a foreign people, even if she irritates him in some way. He may not treat her like a prostitute or like a sex thing. He's got to keep her pure for his son, or rather, if not that, then at least marry her himself. So she's not the woman on the side. She becomes a wife. If he marries another woman, then he may not treat her less well for it. He may not reduce her food or her clothes or a chance to have a kid. If he treats this girl badly in any of these ways, what happens? He forfeits his rights to her. Because this girl, what? Has rights. So if he tries to take them from her, the payment of that for him, she goes free. It's a pretty radical thing to say in the time in which it was written. What he's doing here, what the Lord is doing, is establishing rights for slaves, not just slaves, but slave women. Okay, now, of course, the whole situation is still offensive to our ears, right? Here's a man, he's buying a slave girl to marry, and what is more, he's buying her and maybe some others too. And so this situation has a lot to do with not just slavery, but polygamy and divorce. And these are bad things. So the question really is, and it's a fair question to ask, why is God allowing these bad things? Why is he allowing them? Why is he regulating them? Now, first of all, if you're concerned, you have a good reason to be concerned. That is, this is not how God intended it to be. Right? The creation story tells us that God made marriage for a continual union between one man and one woman. Jesus in the New Testament confirms this in no uncertain terms. This is how it was from the beginning, and you have changed it. So, polygamy and divorce are bad, then why then does God allow them here? And Jesus says this, it's very helpful to us. Jesus says this, that God allowed them because of the hardness of our hearts. In Matthew 19, they say, well, Moses let us get divorced. And he says, he allowed this thing for the hardness of your hearts. That is, he doesn't approve of them exactly, but he's patiently waiting for the Holy Spirit to come into us and soften our hearts. In the meantime, what the law does is almost a stopgap. That is, God places limits on the evil that might be done. So in order to understand the justice of these laws, you kind of have to almost like you have to take off your modern shoes and step into ancient shoes. You have to kind of step into culture, use your imagination a little bit, step into the culture in which they were given. Not everybody could have kids. One way to have kids, if you could not, was to buy a wife and she could act as a surrogate. Right? That's what's going on with Abraham and Sarah. Right? They couldn't have children, so they used Hagar, Sarah's slave, as a surrogate. And the benefits of the situation, by the way, go both ways. It's not just like, oh, Abraham could benefit himself by the use of this woman. It actually works both ways. In the ancient world, think about this, warfare was common and brutal, and many men were dying all the time. What that did then was leave many women destitute and unprotected. And so very often there'd be more than one woman to every man, looking for a good man when there weren't a whole lot of men to be found. Also, not every woman could afford to get married. Remember, in this culture, when a couple gets married, there's a dowry. Right? This is the practice where the father of the bride pays the family of the groom a price. The idea there is that they're going to value her more because of the prosperity of the other family. It's a way to protect her. Well, what do you do if you got a poor dad? Some dads are too poor to pay this dowry, and this meant that there would be a lot of poor women who would have a hard time finding a husband. So then if you think in those contexts, you think about that's kind of like we have concerns of our day about human rights and women's rights, and they're fair. But these are the ones that they're dealing with then and there. And think about how these laws help that situation. Women who had nothing. I mean, the Lord knows that some men have a tendency to treat women as mere objects. He knows that some of them will totally abuse their power, and so what does he do? He comes in and he uses his power to forbid that. He says these are not just sex objects. They're not to be cast aside. They're not to be neglected. They have rights, and if you break their rights, they go free. That's what these laws are designed to do. They give rights to the weak. Again, from our perspective, it's like we look back and we're like, whoa, it's really weird and it seems backward to us. From their perspective, it's unbelievably liberating and restorative and powerful. Again, it's a different culture, so it looks and feels different from what we call justice. It is still just. God does not, think about God's heart. Why would he give these sorts of laws in this situation? Not to push down those who are already pushed down, but to lift up those who have been pushed down. He wants to lift them up. And here's the gospel. He wants to lift us up because he's good. And we can see that he's good, not just in these laws, though I think we can see that he's good in these laws, but we can see it also in the light of Jesus. Jesus takes these black and white laws and kind of puts color in them. How? Well, he takes us as slaves and makes us sons. We come to know him and we say, I don't want to go free. I don't want to be a Christian for 6 years. I love my master. I want to stay. And so he takes out his awl and he pierces our ear and he says, stay then forever. I'll not cast you out. He's a master who's more than a master. And we are slaves who are more than slaves, right? We're sons. Well, not only are we moving from slaves to sons, but also he takes slaves and makes us what? His bride. He takes slaves and makes us his wife. We come poor and weak without protection. And he takes us in and he treats us well. He doesn't need a law to make him good. He doesn't need a law to sort of curb our tendency to abuse power. He's good. He gives himself for our good. What does it say in Ephesians chapter 5? That Christ gave himself up for her so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water and the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. That's where these old slavery laws are going. How does Jesus take such lowly slaves and lift us up so high? By becoming low. Tim Keller draws this out really beautifully. Let me quote him. In Proverbs 14:31, we see that God identifies with the poor. If you oppress the poor, you show contempt for their maker. And if you give to the needy, you honor God. But it is only in Jesus that we see how radically God identifies with the poor and oppressed. He was born in a poor family. He lived among the marginalized and outcast. His trial was a miscarriage of justice. He died violently, naked, penniless. And Christians believe he did this to make atonement for our sins, to free us from their penalty. Christians know then that in the eyes of God, we were spiritually poor and powerless. We too were aliens and slaves. God saves us by becoming oppressed for us. People of God, you do not need to apologize for God. You do not need to be embarrassed by his laws. Instead, you need to understand them in their original context, and you also need to understand them in the context of the gospel. God is good, and his law is good. He takes the lowly and lifts us up. And if you understand these things, then 3 things will be true of you. And I end with this. 3 things will be true of you if you understand these things. First, you will not be afraid or ashamed of any part of the Bible. Instead, you'll be eager to learn and always hopeful that there's a good answer. Some things are harder than others, right? But that you'll be eager to learn. You won't just try to shut it down like I tried to do 20 years ago, like the students cut that one out. Rather, you'll be eager to learn and you'll be hopeful that there's an answer. You'll be bold. The second thing is that you will not be afraid of your own poverty and weakness. Right? Instead, you're going to be grateful to God. He takes the lowly and he lifts us up. And if you do that, then that'll also change your social relationships because you're not going to live protected. You're not going to be trying to keep people from judging you. You won't be afraid of being lowly or weak. You'll be happy, friendly with each other. And the third thing is that you will not treat the poor and the weak among you with contempt. You will not only give honor to the strong and the put together. Instead, you're going to work all the time. It could be laws of the land. It could be the ways that you deal with each other even here in our church. Instead, you're going to work all the time to have just laws as just as the ones we see in the Bible, to lift the lowly up, to protect, to restore. We'll defend the rights of the poor. We'll lift them up. Let's sing. Praise God.